In this video, we're going to talk about the null object pattern. Now, this is considered to be a minor pattern in regards to the game programming patterns, but it's also one of my favorites just because it's very simple and it makes you think in a slightly different way than you're used to. And once you understand how it works, this is a very easy one to implement very immediately in a lot of your code. So the null object pattern solves the issue of when you don't want to have an object inside of a reference, instead of assigning it to null, we're going to assign it to an object that is empty. So we are actually creating an object, but that object doesn't really do anything. It does prevent null error behavior. So like if we assign to nothing, then the compiler doesn't really know what to do with that if we try to access it. But if we assign it to an object that does nothing, then we don't get a compiler error. We just have an object assigned that by design doesn't do anything. And if you think about it, this could be intended behavior in many cases. So if you played a lot of RPGs, maybe you know if you unequip your weapon, it's not null on your weapon. It's either unarmed or it is none. Like that would be your object, would be none or unarmed or whatever. So the idea is sometimes you want a reference to be empty, but for whatever reason, as part of your game, or just to prevent null error checking, you want to create a empty object for that. So let's look at a high-level overview of what this would look like inside of your code. You may have some kind of class. I'm just generically calling this object container. And as part of your class, you may have a reference to an object or a field of a type of thing. This could be a weapon, like current equipped weapon. It could be the ability slot. It could be whatever. And for this, I'm making this purple just to show that it could be abstracted. So in this case, we could have a type of weapon as a base class, and all different types of weapon. We could have a sword, we could have a rocket launcher, we could have a dagger. But as one of those types that would go inside of this type of weapon, we would also have something called no weapon, or we would, whatever we want to call that. I just like this as a simple syntax. No weapon, and inside of no weapon, if we have an attack that all weapons can do, we would have attack, but the method would be empty. It wouldn't really do anything. So the idea here is that we're just making a variation on this type of object that just implements everything that all the other ones do, but inside of those methods doesn't really do anything. We don't want behavior, we just want the object representing nothing that is an actual thing that we're slotting in to avoid a null reference. To go one step deeper and see what some pseudocode might look like, we could have an interface. In this case, we talked about iWeapon. We'll look at iEquipable. It could be iMonster. It could be iAbility. Just anything you want, really. And in this case, it's iExample. And something that all iExamples have to implement would be the method doSomething. So in our first example, we do something and we do a thing. In our second class, we'll call it example 2. It could be 3 different kinds of monsters. All battle cry or on aggro or whatever you want. So in example 2, do something is we could do a different thing. Example 3 is do something, we do a different thing. But in our no example, which also implements the same interface, our do something is actually do nothing. We don't put anything there. But we still implement the method. And that allows us to slot in an iExample anywhere we need it. So anywhere we need the base class or the abstraction, and we can call iExample.doSomething. And no matter what it does, it's either going to do its own particular thing, or in the case of no example, it's not going to do anything. But either way, we are not breaking our code, and we don't need to do our null check. Now, the example that we're going to look at, I'm just going to show you a really simple type of equipable system. And in this case, we're going to have iEquipable, and all things that can be equipped or that are equipable need to include the 2 methods equip and unequip. So no matter what kind of thing, what type of item it is, if it is equipable, it needs those two methods. So the first one, we're going to have a feathery hat. On equip, we can add defense to our stats, and on equip, we're going to reduce our defense from our stats. So basically to undo whatever we did. You could imagine a card game where you could have, you could add an ability, you could add mana, and as soon as you discard the thing, you need to undo that thing. Or maybe you have a special thing that happens on discard, like maybe you apply damage when a thing is discarded or whatever. We want to be able to equip something, and if it's equipable, it also needs to be unequipable. So we have our feathery hat, adds defense, we have our sword of swinging, which adds attack, and we have our no equipment, which means that we don't have anything equipped to that slot. And when we call equip, we're going to do nothing. And when we call unequip, we're also going to do nothing. And the reason that this is valuable is because now in our player inventory, we could call this current equipment or whatever, and it is a type of iEquipable, meaning that we know for sure that all iEquipables can equip and unequip. So we can slot in a feathery hat into our equipment, we can slot in a sword of swinging, and we can slot in our no equipment. And now once we have this, we can call equipment.equip from a method. We could say, equip this thing to the player inventory, and we could pass it a thing, and we could equip it, or we could unequip it. And either way, we don't really have to do our null checks, because we know that if we don't have anything equipped and this is empty, we're assigning it a no equipment. We're not assigning it to null, we are giving it this empty object. So now we've avoided null checking. We are being more proper to our code, because if it is our design intent that something can be unequipped, part of that is we want an object to represent unequipped. We might have a special icon for that or whatever. Imagine a scenario where you're trying to move a player and you want to give it input. You might have an instance where we're not pressing the keyboard, so there's no input. You don't want that to be null. You want the return for that to be no input. So anyway, it's just a super, super handy pattern. The idea is just anytime you're creating types of a thing, just also create a type of a thing that is not that thing. So just literally no of that thing and implement it the exact same way. Just don't put anything in the methods. And that way you don't have to worry about assigning this thing to be null. I mean, you could technically still do your null checking too, but it just saves you the hassle, and it allows you to be more flexible in some of your code. So for example, let's say you're trying to get cards from a deck and you wanted to draw a certain number of cards. If you ran out of cards, you wouldn't want to return null. That could blow up your code. You might want to return no card, and then you could do a check for that and say, oh, well, if it's no card, then you're still returning something, and then you can run off of that. So just a super, super handy pattern. One of my favorites, very simple and very effective, and really fun to use, I think. Now let's look at an example of our null object pattern being used inside of a scene. And this was kind of weird because it's really hard to visualize an equipment system without other graphics, but then that gets in the way of the example. So I'm going to show you in the console what's going on. And if I hit play, let's just see what we have. We have our scene. This could be like a character equip screen or something. Using our null object pattern, if we press 1, and we check the console, we are equipping our sword. We press 2, we are equipping our hat. We can press Q to print our current stats. So we're seeing, okay, we have attack, defense, move speed. If I press backspace to unequip, we see unequipped sword, unequipped feather. And if we print our stats again with Q, you'll see that we're back to our base stats. And then as a special thing, if we equip our weapon, so if we press spacebar and we don't have anything equipped, nothing happens. But if we equip our sword with 1 and we press spacebar, then we can swing our sword. So again, no visuals there, but I hope that you'll understand the example as we kind of look through some of the code. What we have is we have our interface of anything that is equipable, but anything that implements the iEquipable interface will be able to be equipped. And if I double click this is our interface. All things that implement iEquipable need to include equip and unequip. So we're going to go down to our feathery hat, and we see that it is equipable. And in order to be equipable, it needs to implement equip and unequip. So we can add whatever flavor text and bonuses we want right there. But we need to make sure that we undo the same thing. Just one way to do that system. And we have some stats on it or whatever. And we have a link to our character stats. This is called a constructor. This just means that because this is a C# script and not a mono behavior, we need to create it ourselves and we need to give it its references when we create it. So we're just passing it in and then storing it as a reference right there. Okay, and then we also may have a sort of swinging. You'll notice that we have another interface called iWeapon, which is just implementing attack. Different example, but same idea. And to be equipable, we are implementing equip and unequip. We have different stats, and again, we are creating this by passing it through the constructor. Let me just show you this constructor real quick. On our level controller, if we wanted to create a new sort of swinging, we just have to say equals new sort of swinging. And this right here, the parentheses here, this is where we would pass in the references into our constructor, which you see we are receiving, right here, like the stats or whatever. That's how you could do that. If you want to create just C# objects, you would pass it in that way. Now let's look at our null object pattern. We've already recognized that in order to be a no equipable, we need to implement equip and unequip. So we have a class called no equipment that implements equip and unequip, but nothing happens. Like we're literally not doing anything right here whenever equip and unequip gets called. Now we are assigning this empty no equipment object instead of a null object, just to avoid some extra checking and to make sure that we always have something assigned. We want to avoid null. And also we have a no weapon just to show you that as well. And in this case I did a debug.log, but it's not really doing anything substantial. And it's implementing iWeapon because we've defined that on the interface. I'm not really using that for this example. And so just to tie this all together, on our level controller, this is where we're doing our inputs. We are saying when we press backspace, we have this class right here called character stats, and we're accessing that and running a method called unequipAll. Let's hit F12 to jump into that. And unequipAll, all it does is it looks through my weapon slot and my helmet slot, which are defined at the top as an I equipable. So remember, if it's I equipable, we know that anything that implements I equipable right here, right? So we did sort of swinging, I equipable. Because we filled out these methods, it is now I equipable. And we have a weapon and a helmet. And we know that anything we put into here can equip and unequip. So in awake, we're just testing a weapon. So we're just saying new, give it a default weapon, sort of swinging, pass it in the stats because we put that in the constructor right here. And we are saying stats unequipAll. So again, that's F12. So what we're doing now is we're getting all of our inventory slots and we're saying unequip whatever item's in there. So call the unequip on that item to make sure you undo any stat changes. And then assign a new no equipment to the slot. And previously you might have said equals null, but in this case, instead of doing equals null, we're saying assign a new no equipment, which is still technically an object. It's still technically something, but it just does nothing. So if you hear about the null object pattern, that's all we're doing. We're just creating an empty object to represent a series of objects. That's the pattern. And if you just want to see some other code here, we have equip helmet. We can pass in an I equipable. We'd probably have to determine whether or not this is a helmet, but that's we can do other things for that. In this case, we probably should call this equip new item or something. Anyways, inside of the slot, we are calling unequip on whatever is currently being equipped or what is currently equipped. We're going to make sure that we unequip the previous item, assign the new item, and then run the equip of whatever we passed in. You can apply this pattern to anything. You could have different abilities, different enemies, whatever, and then you could make sure that you have goblin, skeleton, but also have a no enemy, or you could have weapons. You could have missile launcher, pistol, no weapon, and then that way you're always checking to make sure that you have something assigned, and you don't have to worry as much about null checking every single line of code. And it makes your code a lot more readable, and many times it is more proper to what is going on. Like, you want to have an unarmed state in your game. You may want to know if there's no input or no cards left is very different from null. Null is saying, I don't know, but no object is saying, I know that there's no object there, if that makes sense. So anyways, yeah, just a little system here. I know I didn't go into the weeds of how it's put together, but as long as you understand the important parts, which is you have an iEquipable, you implement equip and unequip, and then you slot it in, but as one of those iEquipables is a no equipable or no equipment or whatever, and you can do that with pretty much any custom class you want. Anyways, yeah, just one final thing just to remind you of this thing. One is equip sword. We equip the sword. Unequip sword, or unequip, we could press backspace. Unequip it. We could always print our stats. We could equip and then print our stats, and we'd see the stat adjustments. And then here we could attack with it. Backspace, we're filling our slots with no object rather than null. Anyways, hope this helps you out. It's a super simple pattern, but I think it's a pretty interesting one, and hopefully you find many places to use it in your code.